We're so thrilled again to welcome Abra and thank her yet again for a wonderful Rosh Chodesh conversation. This one, as Abra shared with me before, is a difficult conversation because, as she said, Tammuz is not a happy month. So we're really very, very interested and excited to hear what you have to say. So without any further ado, Abra, hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you to all the ladies who made time to come this morning and join us. And welcome. And Chodesh Tov to all. Today is Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, today and tomorrow, actually. So as Sharon mentioned, there are some months in the Jewish calendar which are really full of joy and growth and excitement, and last month Sivan was one of those. If anyone was here, if whoever was here joined us last month for Sivan, you can remember that it was a month about growth, blossoming, fertility, all kinds of good things. Adar was another one of those months. But then there are some months that are like a little darker and a little more challenging. And Tammuz is one of these months, and Av, which is right after Tammuz, is another one. So why do these months come at this time in the calendar? What's the significance in terms of like the larger cycle? Well, let's remember what comes after Av, right? So the next month after Av is Elul. In Elul, the cycle begins again. And Elul will start preparing for Rosh Hashanah, for Yom Kippur, for everything that comes with the new year, right? We start preparing ourselves spiritually for a complete renewal in the following month, which is Tishrei, and that's when actually all the holidays take place, most of the holidays of the year, the high holidays, and all the holidays that we are very much looking forward to celebrating together, hopefully. So when we look at it in this light, we can see that we look at the cycle kind of like as a whole, we can see that it makes sense that before we can reach Elul and, God willing, Tishrei and renewal and redemption, that we have to face something that deeply challenges us as a people and as individuals, and something that reminds us of like how precious our special relationship with God is, right? Like before we can really renew our relationship with God, we have to remember how special it is and how fragile it is, and how many times we almost came close to losing it, and how important it is that we cling to it, and how important it is to remember the times that it was threatened, so that we can become aware as we approach Elul and Tishrei of how valuable this relationship is as we face renewal in another year. So something that I always like to do in these sessions is to talk about the Torah source of the biblical month, to kind of ground us in like a textual understanding. Now, what's interesting about Tammuz is that even though it is packed with a lot of really important moments in Jewish history, which we've probably all learned about at some point, it's not actually referred to directly in the Torah. So by the Torah, I mean the 5 books of Moses that we're familiar with, but we do find a reference to it in the book of prophets, or Nevi'im. So it is in the canon of Tanakh, which is Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, Torah, prophets, and writings, but it's not actually in the 5 books of Moses. But before I read the pasuk, there's a little bit of context that's important to note. It may surprise you to know that the name Tammuz, the word Tammuz, is actually the name of a Babylonian sun god. It's the name of a pagan god. Why in the world is a Hebrew month named after a pagan god? That seems very strange, doesn't it? Well, actually, as we're going to learn, it makes sense because the tragedies and the darkness of this month actually have a lot to do with idol worship and with this idea of kind of turning away from God. So with that, let's talk about the Torah source, or the source in prophets. This comes from the book of Ezekiel. So we'll read the Hebrew of the first pasuk first, and then we'll go ahead in English. V'yavoti el petach sha'ar beit Hashem, asher el hatzvona, v'hine sham hanashim yoshvot mekabot et hatamuz. And he took me to the door of the gate of the house of God, which was facing towards the north, and behold, there the women sat weeping for Tammuz. So on a basic level, what are we seeing? we're seeing that the prophet Ezekiel is describing how Hashem brought him to see that the women of Israel, Jewish women, were sitting at the gate of God's house, in other words, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and they're weeping for a Babylonian sun god. And a few verses later we read, and he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs towards the temple of the Lord, and their faces towards the east, and they worshiped the sun towards the east. God is obviously furious. He says, speaking through Ezekiel, therefore will I also deal in fury, mine eye shall not spare, neither will I have pity, and though they cry in mine ears with a loud voice, yet I will not hear them. So this is very heavy stuff, right? We're seeing the Jewish people committing a huge abomination, a shocking, very disturbing, very upsetting sight. The Jewish people are literally turning their backs on God within the temple itself. They're sitting in the temple. They're turning their backs on the Holy of Holies, on God's place on earth, and they're worshiping the sun. And as a result, God is turning his back on the Jewish people. And this is kind of a good grounding for where we're going to start with Tammuz. It's not a good month. There are a few significant dates in the month of Tammuz. The most significant, or the most widely observed, is the 17th of the month, or Shiva Asar Tammuz, which is a minor fast day. So throughout the year, we have two major fast days, which are Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is coming up in Av. And then we have 5 minor fast days, which just means that it's a rabbinic fast. It's ordained by the rabbis rather than the Torah. And it lasts not from sundown to sundown, like Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av, but just from sun up to sundown, so 12 hours instead of 24, 25. So this minor fast marks the beginning of the 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av. So it officially begins as mourning period, which we observe every year in remembrance of the destruction of the temple. So both temples were actually destroyed during this time. The date 17 Tammuz also marks like a number of very serious and tragic events that have occurred throughout Jewish history, and many of them have to do with idol worship. And all of them have to do with turning our backs on Hashem, both ritually and spiritually. So these are the 5 tragedies of 17 Tammuz, and this list comes from Mishnah. They all relate to the breakdown of Jewish spiritual life. And some of them you'll see originated with like Jewish sin, but a lot of them seem to come from outside the Jewish people, which is interesting, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. So the first, and I think the most serious on this list, is that Moses breaks the tablets containing the 10 commandments when he comes down from Mount Sinai. So even though the Torah doesn't actually mention that this happens in Tammuz, we know it's the 4th month because we know that on the 7th day of Sivan is when Moses climbed Mount Sinai to receive the Torah from Hashem. So he told the people to expect him 40 days later. But the people miscounted. There was some confusion about what day he left and whether that counted as a day. Long story short, he didn't return on the day that they expected, on the 16th of the 4th month, Tammuz. And they panicked and they built the golden calf. And he's actually talked about how the golden calf kind of represents an interesting moment for Jewish women, in that it's when we kind of got Rosh Chodesh as a holy day. That's not what we're going to talk about now, but it's just a interesting little tie back to our first Rosh Chodesh session. Anyway, when Moses did descend the following day, the 17th, he saw the people worshiping the golden calf, right? And he was so furious that he broke the tablets containing the 10 commandments, threw them on the ground. So that's the first of these 5 tragedies. The second tragedy comes several hundred years later. We're already in the period of the first temple. Jerusalem is besieged, and the high priests have to stop offering the daily sacrifice to Hashem in the first temple because Jerusalem is surrounded. They can't get animals for sacrifice. The third and 4th and 5th, actually, the next 3 all occur around the time of the destruction of the second temple. 17 Tammuz, what it's best known for, is that it's the day that the walls around Jerusalem were breached in the time of the second temple, which is around the year 70. And this is the siege that would actually lead to the destruction of the second temple on Tisha B'Av, right? So this is the kind of defining moment of the 3 weeks. And And on that day, when the walls were breached and the Romans entered Jerusalem, the Romans placed an idol in the sanctuary of the Holy Temple. And there can really be no greater desecration than this, right? And a Roman general burned a Torah scroll. So those are the three things that happened on the day of 17 Tammuz in the year 70, preceding the destruction of the Second Temple. So on a basic level, it does sound like many of these events actually came as the result of oppressive regimes and enemies punishing the Jews and attacking the Jews, right? So it's not the Jews' fault, it's the Romans or the Assyrians or whoever is coming to destroy Jerusalem. But it's important to note here that nothing happens without God's will, right? And our tradition actually teaches that the desecration and the destruction of the temple were really not a result of enemies coming in and attacking the Jews unprovoked that had developed within the Jewish people. So where does this come from? Let's very quickly revisit some biblical history here. King Solomon built the first holy temple in Jerusalem, and he united the Jews in a time of peace and prosperity. He's known as a very, very righteous king for most of his life, and he merited to build the temple and bring the Jewish people together. But after his death, as often happens when we're talking about dynasties, kings, princes, sons, the Jewish people were divided and they split into two kingdoms, and those are the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And unfortunately, many of the kings in both of these kingdoms regularly practiced idolatry and built temples to idols, despite God's warning. A number of prophets in the years before the destruction of the first temple would repeatedly, constantly warn the Jewish people and the leaders of the kingdoms that their ways, their errant ways, and their idol worship would lead to disaster. One of these prophets was Jeremiah, and we're going to read his warnings actually in the book of Lamentations, in the book of Eicha, on Tisha B'Av, and the words are chilling, they're painful. It's very hard to hear of the very dark path down which the Jewish people had been traveling. But they didn't want to listen. The people and the kings decided they didn't want to listen, and they didn't change their ways. And as a result, these fractured kingdoms that weren't united, they were vulnerable to their enemies. And these enemies were able to invade the Jewish kingdoms and conquer the cities and destroy the temples. So although on a basic level, it seems like these were outside factors, actually they're really caused by internal problems in the Jewish people. So let's bring this back down. Let's shrink it down a little bit to us and talk about how it affects us. What does all this tragic history actually have to do with us today? Well, there's a very practical answer to that question, which is that in the month of Tammuz, as we mentioned, we begin the mourning period of the 3 weeks, which is the time between 17 Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. So in Hebrew, this period of time is known as Bein HaMitzarim, which means between the straits. During these 3 weeks, we are walking a tightrope. We are suspended between one disaster and another. This is a time of real danger for the Jewish people. When we talk about the number of things that have gone wrong, that have happened to us during this time, it's an overwhelming list. You can look it up. A lot of bad things have happened to us during the 3 weeks. It's also a time of a very practical constriction and limitations. It's kind of similar to the period of the Omer, which we learned about in ER. It's a time when we are not allowed to participate to the same extent in our communal joys and our celebrations, which means we're not allowed to conduct weddings during the 3 weeks. We aren't supposed to listen to music or play instruments, or cut our hair or shave. And the laws become even more strict when the month of Av starts and we enter the 9 days before Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av means the 9th day of Av, so they're 9 days before. And during these 9 days, we enter a very intense period of mourning, and we're not even permitted to eat meat during this time because it gives us too much pleasure. So these are the practical restrictions that we still feel coming down from history, but it's all kind of still very general, right? And it's all maybe a little distant, and maybe we still struggle with how to relate to these ideas on a personal level, because speaking from personal experience, I don't think any of us are tempted to worship idols, right, when things go wrong. So why are we still feeling the effects of this punishment? What does this have to do with us? So that brings us to what I think is like the core issue of Tammuz. And I think it's actually a very simple answer to this question. And that if we take like a deeper dive into some of what we've learned, and we take some of these historical lessons and distill them down to like the very basic level of what it means for us, that we'll see that we're not really being punished for idol worship or these grand divisions within the Jewish people, but what's happening is so much more human than that. And I think it's more problematic to our relationship with God. And I also think it's something that we all probably do from time to time. And that sounds like crazy. Like, I don't worship idols, you know, this doesn't have anything to do with me. But actually, when we look down at the roots of these events, I think we're going to find that it does have something to do with all of us. So let's first look back at that first event of one of the tragedies, the first tragedy of the 17th of Tammuz. So that is what we'll call, it's Moses breaking the tablets. So he did that because the people lost faith in him, right? And Hashem. And they panicked. They only had to wait one day, but they couldn't. They immediately began anticipating the worst, expecting disaster, even though they really had no evidence that everything was wrong. In fact, they had more evidence that, you know, of God's power they had experienced firsthand. He had taken them out of Egypt. He had brought them to the desert, and they had vowed to remain faithful. But when, you know, the moment came that they were tested, they forgot so quickly, and they gave up so easily, and they lost faith in God. They experienced like a slight hiccup in their plans or expectations, and almost instantly they assumed that God and Moses had abandoned them completely. And in their desperation and their panic, they abandoned God. And they built a golden calf. That's the form that their panic took. And maybe none of us, I hope that none of us have ever felt that we wanted to abandon or turn away from God, or God forbid, worship an idol. But I would be very surprised if none of us had ever felt or feared that God had abandoned us, right? We've all been through very difficult moments and times in our lives when we didn't understand why a bad thing was happening to us. Like death, illness, loss, loneliness, depression, the list goes on. We've all had these moments. We've all had these moments of darkness where we just felt alone. And it's so easy and so natural in those moments to feel that Hashem is not there, right? And it's much harder by far to keep that faith that Hashem still has a plan for you and a place for you. And it's much easier to panic, make assumptions, and to go kind of deeper and deeper down this rabbit hole of despair, you know, to move further away from God, to abandon this belief which seems so just huge and kind of unapproachable, this idea that some great invisible power cares about you and has control over your life. And the idea that you're alone and that you alone are responsible for your well-being becomes, you know, a lot more practical. It just becomes, it seems more real. You know, it's hard to relate to that larger power in your moment of despair. And it's hard to feel that somebody's looking out for you when you don't feel that in your life. So instead of looking outward and looking upward towards Hashem, we turn inwards and we only look at ourselves and what we can control. And I think that when we wrap ourselves up in this blanket of self, right? When we deny there's a larger force and a larger power in our lives that, you know, even if we can't see it or understand it or feel that it's there, this is a type of turning our back on God. And it's this same core belief that led the Israelites to sin in the desert with the golden calf. They felt like God had given up on them, and they were desperate for any kind of comfort that they could find. And I think it's the same belief that's kind of further drawn out that led to the fractures between Israelite tribes and the kingdoms. Each faction felt that it had the best claim to rule. Each king felt that he had the true power. Each tribe felt that it was the most entitled. So in other words, they all felt they had to control their destinies rather than trust that Hashem's plan was the true one. So none of them were willing to accept the larger will of God Even when they were directly told by prophets, by men of God, what God wanted, they thought they knew better than God. And they felt the consequences of that when their kingdoms were torn apart and the holy temples were destroyed. And the Jewish people were sent into exile, and we're still feeling the consequences of that today. When we attempt to shut down the influence of God in our lives, when we think we know better, when we feel anger at God, or when we dismiss him, when we believe that only we are in control, and when we believe that God doesn't care about us, and that we aren't ready or willing to rely on him and to trust him, then we're in grave danger of seriously damaging our relationship with him and with Judaism and with each other. We are literally bein hamitzarim. We are between the straits. We are running a great risk. And this moment of danger, the possibility of ultimate destruction of our communities and our families and our faith is exactly what we're facing, right? We're facing in Tammuz. It may seem so huge at first that it's really not applicable to us, but when we look more closely, we can see that the true causes of this danger are actually so small. Like a large crack starts with a tiny little fracture. And it's so very real for many of us, and that we're all at risk for these feelings of doubt and fear and loneliness. And that we have to be aware, especially in Tammuz, especially during this difficult, very dangerous time, of the fragility of our relationship with God. And we have to treasure it and nurture it, even when it's hard to do, and especially when it's hard to do. Before we start our conversation, I know I've been talking for a while. I just want to read to you something from Birkat HaChodesh, which is the blessing of the new month that we heard this past Shabbat in Shul, for Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. I think that often when we're davening, it's very easy to just kind of skim the prayer or listen to this beautiful singing and not really internalize the word. So I wanted to share something that really struck me while my very talented husband was reciting this prayer in Shabbat, and that I think really relates to our session today. So I'm just reading from the Siddur, the blessing of the new month, Birkat HaChodesh. In English, we read, "May it be your will, Lord our God and God of our fathers, to renew for us this coming month for good and blessing." That's the first line of the prayer. So then directly after this, we continue reading, and we read, "Grant us long life, a life of peace, a life of goodness, a life of blessing, a life of sustenance, a life of physical health, a life marked by reverence for heaven and dread of sin, a life without shame or disgrace, a life of wealth and honor, a life in which we have love for Torah and reverence for heaven, a life in which our heart's desires are fulfilled for good." So when I was reading this prayer, what really struck me is that in the first sentence, what are we asking for? We're asking for a good month. But then immediately afterwards, we up the ask. We say, actually, what we really want is a good life. Forget the month. Like, give us a good month, but actually give us a good life. We're not saying, give us a month of physical health, or a month without shame or disgrace, or a month of wealth and honor. We're saying, give us a year of those things, right? We're not asking for a month at a time of blessing. We ask for a lifetime. We want more. And to me, like that prayer, that kind of transition suddenly from like, give us a good month to give us a good life, is like a very beautiful expression of faith, because we're going to ask for a blessed month because a new month is another moment of spiritual time in which we can connect to God. But actually we feel so sure that God is going to give us a good month that we're going to ask for so much more, right? We feel so confident that God wants to give us these blessings that we're not going to be shy with our demands. We're going to ask for more. So this is the blessing that I want all of us to take into Tammuz. Instead of turning away from God, instead of believing that he cannot or will not act in our lives like some of our ancestors did, let's believe instead that he wants to give us all the blessings that we can handle. And let's ask for those blessings with confidence in his love for us instead of doubt, and with strong faith that in spite of the challenges and the pitfalls of Tammuz, we're going to get to the other side of the strait. We're going to get through.